I would like to start by acknowledging my collaborator, Jamie Lynn Harris. She is a culture and media major at Brown University. She was instrumental in working through the intellectual problems related to today's presentation, as well as some of the technical and creative aspects. The title of the talk today is The Ethics of Identity in the Development of a Culturally Diverse Nanoscience and Engineering Workforce. What is the psychological utility of narrative cases? I'd like to start today by having you engage in thinking about your own lives and your own experiences. So hopefully everyone has a card. And with that card, I'd just like to take a few moments to have you think about your own lives and experiences. If someone were to ask you to write the story of your life, what would be the titles of your 5 chapters? If you had to write the story of your life, what would be the titles of your 5 chapters? If you could just take a minute or two. So I'd like to talk to you. I know you may not be finished yet, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the psychology of what I just asked you to do. The exercise of thinking about your life in storied form is one way to think about identity construction. It's human nature for individuals to think in storied terms. So you might have had an easy time thinking about your life experiences, and in doing that, you may have done that through thinking about your experiences in terms of certain plots, certain characters, certain themes in your life. The important aspect of this is this idea that it's human nature. So all human beings can think in storied terms. It's a part of cognition. Often we think about stories as some product, something that is told, but psychologists think about story in terms of internalized and evolving narrative of self. The other thing that's interesting about story and narratives is that story cuts across culture, this cognitive way of thinking about self. So many of us are probably from very different cultures. However, we were psychologically able to access stories of self. And it's interesting that largely this idea of the psychology of story has not been explored as much as it could be in engineering and science ethics, particularly around graduate education and professional development. This idea of identity as an internalized and evolving narrative of self, again, it's a form of identity. This is called the life story model of identity. I'm sure that some of you may have thought about, when you were writing your chapters, your occupational identity. Were there any people here who thought about who they are as scientists or researchers, or there might be some graduate students here who thought about their education and training around their occupation? This is the aspect of your identity that psychologists call occupational identity. There's also personal identity. Some of you might have had chapter titles that reflect something that's very unique to you and who you are and how you think about the answer to the question, who am I, and how do I bring unity and purpose to my life? And then there might be others of you who thought about a chapter in your life story related to a social identity. So there might be some women who thought about their lives, particularly maybe the intersection of their social identity and their occupational identity. So I want to show you an example of an individual thinking about his identity construction around occupational and identity academic development.
I was fascinated with electronic radios and televisions, I guess. And in fact, in high school, I used to have a small business repairing televisions and radios. And I always enjoyed that. As a result, result of that, I got into what's called, I got a commercial FCC license, which basically at that time was called a first-class commercial license, which allowed me to operate a television station or a radio station. And so through that, you had to take a series of exams. You had to know quite a bit about electronics. And that's initially how my interest started, I guess. The other thing that happened is that we got together and we found out how a lot of the students were getting good grades. And they were involved in fraternities, and the fraternities had all the exams. And so, like, that summer, I remember the summer of my junior year, we went to the director of the engineering program, and we asked him if we could get a copy of the notes from his fraternity house, because they had all the notes on all the professors. That fall of our junior year, the black grade point average in engineering was higher than the white grade point average in engineering. One Christmas break, I remember, even in college, digital watches came out. And I don't know if you remember, that was quite a big thing, you know, to have a digital watch. In fact, there was a watch called a Pulsar. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah. But it was this big, ugly looking thing that you would put on your arm, and it would only come on when you push the button, because the batteries would run out if you left it on permanently. And so one Christmas, I'll never forget, I was downtown and I happened to be by a jeweler, and I saw people bringing digital watches in there, and the jeweler couldn't figure out how to set the time on the digital watch. And so that Christmas, I made a whole lot of money just setting the time on digital watches.
So through that example, I hope that you could hear this individual's ideas about occupational identity, how his interest in electronics started, how he thought about himself and his social identity and social group after at Cornell he got a hold of the same resources that other students had that were part of a social group. As was just discussed previously, issues in nanoethics also are social issues. They're not just scientific issues. And I hope that example helped you see the intersection between social identity construction and occupational identity. At Howard University, there are a group of us who are developing a narrative ethics model. This is led by Dr. Taft Broome, who you'll hear from later this afternoon. And it's a collaboration between an engineer, a philosopher, and a psychologist. So our meetings are quite intellectually rigorous. Our model extends previous narrative ethics models through focus on mythic heroes, African folklore, and then narrative psychology. And again, what I try to do is help us understand the psychology of using story or narrative to solve ethical problems. It's really about working through ethical problems in science and engineering, education, and professional development. And it's not so much about the ethical questions of right and wrong. It's about cultural worldview. From whose perspective? From whose worldview? So you'll hear more about some of this later this afternoon. What I hope today, hopefully so far, I have increased some understanding around this idea of identity as storied, social, occupational, and personal. As we move through the presentation, I hope to continue to raise questions about the intersection of identity, ethics, life experiences, and the development of the nanoscience workforce. And hopefully some of you will be stimulated or interested in the use of story to work through ethical problems in nanoscience. It was interesting to me to think about the investment of nanotechnology in the world. If you look at the United States and you look at funding of nanotechnology research and development, you will see almost a 500% increase in about 8 years. And that could be a result of the Nanotechnology Act of 2003. But clearly, nanotechnology is at the center, some might argue, of the economic growth and productivity in the country. And that brings us to some key questions. What counts as important problems to solve in nanoscience and nanotechnology? Who benefits and what is the cost? Who decides the answers to these questions about what are important problems to pursue, what are the costs, and who benefits? And I would like to suggest that who participates is very important. Who is participating in nanoscience and technology research? In industry, in government, and university. When you look at two groups who are increasing in numbers in American society, African American and black females and Hispanic females, what you can see from here is that there are small numbers earning PhDs in engineering. And you'll also notice that there's a fluctuation. And nanoscience and technology, its direction is not self-directional. It's influenced by who is participating, and that impacts the questions that are pursued, how they're pursued. And I just used the example from two cultural groups, but there are multiple cultural groups who can and should shape the nanoscience and technology agenda.
For some reason, there seems to be tremendous fear in the black community when it comes to mathematics. And I don't know why that is the case. Because a lot of things that we do are mathematical in nature. For example, music is mathematical. Science, there's as much art to science as there is science to science. And I just wish people would realize that more and emphasize that more, and there would probably be more scientists. And being a nanoscientist means that you can actually build things from the bottom up, using the most fundamental things that we know about. And those are atoms and molecules to construct all kinds of things. Some are mechanical in nature, some are electrical in nature, some may have medical applications. So it's really an area that has that allows people to unify science, and has done a great job in getting people together with all kinds of backgrounds to solve really problems. And everybody comes to that problem with a different set of glasses, and so that makes that allows people to get solutions a lot faster. We had a project that we're in the process of a patent. We have a patent application for a prosthesis retina device. It's a artificial retina device that gets implanted in the eye, and it's for people who suffer from what's called age-related macular degeneration. And of course, that's a disease that happens to the retina of the eye, and the retina of the eye no longer functions. So what this device does is it basically takes in light and it converts it to electricity. And that electricity stimulates something called the ganglion cells, and then they fire electrical pulses through the optic nerve, and basically that's how you see. So it's for...
So there, the idea of different people from different cultures participating in solving nanotechnology and nanoscience problems, that idea is something that we could discuss and debate whether or not that is an ethical question. But that idea of nanotechnology as a unifying science, I think, is an interesting idea. So why the ethics of identity? Thinking about identity in this way, one of the reasons why this is important is because identity is a source of life. At least psychologists think of it in that way. And identity directs and influences value. And that's the last idea that I want to leave you with, is this idea about value. So how does identity fit into our broader moral projects? One view is this: there are many things of value in the world. Their value is objective. They are important whether or not anybody recognizes they are important. But there is no way of ranking these many goods or trading them off against one another. So there is not always, all things considered, is the best thing to do. As a result, there are many morally permissible options. And one thing that identity provides is a source of value. As we think about this question of inclusion and diversity in nanoscience and technology, I thought it was interesting when I read this book on the ethics of identity that the author in the last chapter mentioned that the final responsibility for each life is always the responsibility of the person whose life it is. And it made me think about, well, whose responsibility is the talent development of the next generation of nanoscientists and technologists? I selected the case of Dr. Gary Harris to share with you today because he's someone who is committed to what NSF calls the integration of research and education. He's not only made contributions to basic science and applications in nanoscience and technology, but to human development. He has developed what is called the Nano Express, which is a mobile lab that he's taken, and it's reached over 14,000 high school students. He's also been the advisor for 100 black Ph.D.s in electrical engineering. Last year alone in the United States, there were 10 African Americans who earned Ph.D.s in electrical engineering. And of that 10, he mentored 4. And so clearly, he thinks about his own responsibility. In fact, I asked him this question: what sort of responsibility do you believe you have or don't have with respect to increasing the numbers of African Americans and females in nanotechnology and engineering generally?
Well, I try to go back and look at my own career development and to a certain extent. And I think about, to a certain extent, it's sometimes about the little things. And that's why I developed a mobile lab to go out and maybe, touch one person, or maybe reach, in a high school of 100 kids, maybe reach one person or 2 people. I see that as my role, to go out and just expose people, tell them what the possibility is. Why don't we figure out how we can just take the lab to them? And when I first mentioned this to some of our colleagues in our network, they laughed at me. They said, "How are you gonna build a lab that you can take to a high school? You're crazy, you're out of your mind. And it's gonna be a functional lab? That'll never work." And they changed their mind, however, when they saw the lab, and just got a chance to see some of the literally thousands of people that we had opportunity of touching. Okay, my name is Gary Lynn Harris, and I'm in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and I'm the director of the Howard Nanoscale Science and Engineering Facility.
Identity is storied and a powerful psychological element of understanding the life experiences of nanoscientists across all cultures. Today, I used an example of life experiences and perspectives of one individual, an African-American male who's part of a larger life story study that I'm conducting. However, the same types of stories and experiences around occupational identity and academic identity development certainly could be collected and used, and I have some tools that I can share with you for how to collect these kinds of stories. Ethics in nanoscience graduate education should include pursuit of questions about culture, worldview, and personhood, and story is a good mechanism to do that. Narrative psychology is a tool. So how might you use nanoscientists and stories in your own graduate education teaching and mentoring? Why not, if you're a graduate student in nanotechnology, write your own story of self or collect stories? This might be a way that nanotechnologists and scientists can communicate across the disciplines about what nanotechnology is and what it takes in terms of training, what some of the research is about. And again, there's some tools that I can share with you to collect these kinds of stories. To conclude, I just want to come back to this idea about the final responsibility for each life. Certainly, we are responsible for self. At the same time, I think it's interesting to consider what kind of responsibility, given the importance of nanotechnology in the economy, in the future of the workforce, what kind of responsibility do each one of us have to increase the interest and literacy and even the participation of some of the human talent in the U.S. in this enterprise? And it's not just about an isolated few, it's about creating a context in which individuals across cultures can flourish. Today, I know that I integrated a lot of issues around psychology, around ethics, around nanotechnology, but I think that this quote really represents all of the ideas that I try to share with you today. I'd just like to read it to close, if that's okay. Unity and purpose in human lives are products of a complex set of interactions between the individual person and the society in which his or her behavior is embedded. Societies provide occupational, ideological, and relational resources upon which the individual can draw in formulating his or her own identity. The resources are shaped into a personalized life product which ideally confers upon the individual a sense of unity and purpose, a feeling, belief that the person is whole and that his or her life is justified by reason, mission, or goal. If identity is to be vital, the person must in some sense transform the world and thereby leave his or her mark upon it. Yet the world, the socio-historical environment, is not an object that can be completely transformed or transcended. Consequently, forming an identity is not simply a matter of distinguishing oneself from the surround. The counterpoint to separation in formulating a personal identity is reintegration within one's socio-historical context, that is, establishing connections as well as separations. If identity is like a painting, environmental opportunities are the canvas and colors. Through the final artistic creation is a unique expression, highly personalized and thus differentiated from all other works of art. The artist is limited by the materials at hand. In art and in living, we cannot transcend our resources. Thank you.